Hello and welcome back to the Perch. This week, our crime and public safety reporter, Ivy Secrest, is bringing us a story about a new policy in Laramie County School District 1 that has been implemented this year that some are worried is transphobic, while proponents of the policy believe that it supports parental rights. So she'll bring us that in a minute, but before we get to that, we'll have a quick local news roundup. I've got Hannah Shields here, our state government reporter. What did you work on this week?
Last week, the School Facilities Commission approved a plan that will close 8 elementary schools across Laramie County School District 1 and will also release funds to build 2 new elementary schools in the South Triad. Right after the commission gave its final approval, some parents threatened to pull their kids out of Laramie County School District 1. The previous night, there was about an hour-and-a-half long public comment period where parents lined up to the podium to express their extreme disapproval of this plan. However, the next morning, the School Facilities Commission still approved it. So basically what that means is that now ARP Elementary, where the kids have been held in a swing space for over a year and a half now, in East Ridge Elementary, will be demolished and rebuilt as a K-4 school.
And what's the timeline on that? When are all those constructions supposed to be completed by?
So construction plans are basically slated to start immediately for the new K-4 school, replacing ARP Elementary, and it is projected to open in July of 2028. The South Triad will also receive a new grades 5 through 6 school, and I believe that construction is also slated to start soon, and the school is projected to open in 2027.
Thank you, Hannah. Now, Ivy, what have you been working on this week?
So Taylor and I have both been working on mental health stories for a magazine that the paper also produces. I specifically focused on how these false reports of school shootings in LCSD1 have been impacting the mental health of students and how parents in the district can respond or help their students through this if they want to. I spoke with a parent and her child, I spoke with the district, and I spoke with the Wyoming Department of Education. And while typically school shootings and lockdowns have a really negative impact on mental health, what we're seeing for the kids at East, who just went through their third false lockdown of the year, is that they're becoming desensitized to school shootings and the severity of that. And so really what I found in my reporting is that for students who are feeling scared or are feeling uneasy in their classrooms, there are a lot of resources through the school and throughout the state that they can turn to. They can turn to their counselors. They can utilize the WDE's Care Connection program, and that'll set them up with Care Solace that can connect them with the mental health services that they need, and they can continue to access those services after they graduate. They also can turn to their parents. One student that I spoke with this morning, actually, Jalen, told me that for her, she never really talks to counselors. She mostly speaks with her mom, and just being able to talk with her mom about her concerns about the continued shutdowns and the false threats and what happens if we keep getting these false threats and then one day they're real. Just having her mom listen to her has been a huge help. So for parents who are worried about their kiddos going through these continued false reports and lockdowns, listening can go a long way.
Great. Thank you, Ivy and Hannah. Now, keeping on the theme of Laramie County School District 1 and education coverage, we'll hear from Ivy a deeper dive on your reporting on the name change policy that went into effect this year. So now I'm here with Ivy Secrest, our crime and public safety reporter, and you had a story that came out this weekend about a new rule that the Wyoming legislature mandated. Was it earlier this year when they passed it, Ivy?
Yeah, so the Wyoming legislature required that school districts across the state develop a parental rights policy. They didn't specifically mandate the policy that I ended up writing about, but they did mandate that all of the districts had to write a formal parental rights policy. and a procedure for how to handle complaints should those parental rights be violated. Most districts, so I ended up covering that for Laramie County School District 1 and 2, and most districts kind of kept along these lines of looking at updating parents on mental, educational, behavioral health type issues. So calling the parent before administering any sort of medical care, calling the parent and notifying them prior to screening for any sort of mental health issues, notifying parents of any sort of academic change. And proponents of this policy really lean into this idea that it's giving back parents their rights. Those opposed to this policy kind of point to how a lot of these things were common practice prior to the policy. A lot of times it is district policy to notify a parent if your child is failing a class or if they, got a concussion in gym class. What this kind of changes is the order of how things are handled. So instead of treating the kid for whatever medical thing happened, then calling the parent to say, hey, your kid hit their head in gym class today, they got a concussion, you might want to take them to a specialist. They would call the parent prior saying, hey, your kid hit their head, we would like their permission or your permission to treat the concussion. The point that I ended up writing about was a point relatively unique to Laramie School District 1, which was the name change policy that they worked into their definition of change. So all of these parental rights policies have a definition of change. And the policy is that the school will notify parents of any changes that happen with these kids. And in Laramie School District 1, we now have a name change policy written into our definition of change. And that means that if you, as a teacher, have a student who wants to go by a name that isn't on their registration, you are required to call the parent and tell them that and get their permission to use that name. And if you don't get parental permission to use that name, then you can't. You have to call the child by what's on their registration, despite the child's opposition to that.
In that aspect of the policy that was not mandated by the Wyoming legislature, that was the school district itself that chose to implement that. Is that correct?
That is correct. The Wyoming legislature didn't go and say, we have an issue of children going by different names and we need to fix this on a statewide level, so every school's going to fix it. That's not what their mandate was. The mandate was specifically to have the parental rights policy put into place. So what those parental rights policies look like is, it does vary district to district, and this name change point was specific to Laramie County 1. And a lot of the policies do address LGBTQ issues, at least subtly. And that's kind of where this story ended up going. Basically, if you have students who are notifying teachers that they want to go by a different name, well, who are those students? Most of the time, they're genderqueer or transgender students. You don't have a lot of kids that are, very passionate about a nickname that's in line with their legal name. And if you do, those children are protected under this policy. It specifically says that if the name change is a common derivative of the name and registration, then the school doesn't have to notify the parents. So, if you have an Alexander going by Alex, they're not going to call you and say, is it okay to call your kid Alex? But if you have an Alexander wanting to go by Alicia, then they're going to call. And so this went into effect this year for the first time. And I spoke with teachers, LGBTQ advocates, and then those who were proponents of the name change. So basically looking at, how does this impact everyone who wanted it, everyone who didn't want it, and the teachers that have to enforce it. And what I found through my reporting is that a lot of teachers, whether they are proponents of the bill or not, find it very stressful and overwhelming to comply with this parental rights policy. A point that was brought up pretty often is that it feels pretty terrible to have to choose between neglecting what a student wants and neglecting what a parent wants. because your job is to teach. And most teachers that I spoke with kind of reiterated this point of, you get into education because you love kids and you want to support them and you want to teach them and, model the next generation. And when you have a student who feels very passionately about their identity and they take that step of being brave enough to come out to their peers and to their teachers, but it's not necessarily welcomed at home, it feels pretty awful to have to be the one to call the parents and essentially out that student. And then on the flip side of that, you do care about the relationship with parents as well, and it feels pretty awful to ignore what parents are asking as well. So a lot of teachers that I spoke with feel very caught in the middle. And then, there is also the very real impact of what this means for the mental health of trans students. We had one teacher bring up that she was really worried about the mental health of her students, that from the trainings that they take on suicide risk, they know that LGBTQ students are at high risk for suicide, and when you don't affirm their identity or at least acknowledge it, that risk goes up. And she noted that, on the extreme, she worries about losing a student, having a student kill themselves over this. And she expressed that that's the worst day of a teacher's life, is to lose a student. And then on the less extreme end of that, she worries about students dropping out, because that's something that also can happen, is if school isn't a safe place for kids, they just don't show up. And if they don't show up, they don't graduate. If they don't graduate, they don't have their diploma, and that has a whole slew of a trickle effect.
It sounds like the teachers that you spoke to found this to be navigating this policy a bit difficult in their job. So how are they approaching that in the classroom this year for the past few months since it's been implemented in the new school year?
So the teachers that I spoke with noted that, they feel caught between the parents' wants and the students' wants. And then also this pressure from their schools and from their administrators to not be the first school to get sued over this, to have to go through the non-compliance part of this policy. And so what they've been doing is not addressing these students, or addressing them by nicknames, or not nicknames, but buddy, friend, pal, gesturing to a student instead of outright calling out their name when they raise their hand in class. And, this isn't necessarily in the story, but when the teacher did talk about watching a student who had previously been able to be addressed by their preferred name have to go back to being addressed by their registered name after this policy was put into place because of the parental decision, and becoming less active in class, much more reserved, not necessarily not, keeping up with their schoolwork, but not really participating anymore.
Yeah, and even if a teacher hears the student's friends calling them by that nickname that's not similar to their name, are they still required to notify the parents even if they're not the ones calling the student by that nickname?
Yeah, that is, so the policy does require, or at least the way that they're treating the policy right now, if a teacher is out in the hallway and hears a student being called by a name that isn't on their registration or isn't a common derivative of the registered name, then they have to call the parent, even if they weren't directly involved in that communication. And it has been confusing for teachers. I know of one instance in the district where a teacher didn't have access to Infinite Campus for whatever reason, had never seen this student's registered name, and had been calling them by their preferred name because that's what they had been introduced to that student as. And I know that specific teacher in that specific school, the administration's response to that was, oh, this is what we need to nip in the bud. This is what we're trying to avoid, is this miscommunication that will get us in trouble out of the gate. You cannot do that anymore. We need to make sure that you have access to Infinite Campus so you know what all of these kids go by. And a lot of proponents for the bill, or for the point, specifically, Moms for Liberty was a big group that was really invested in getting this point across. And they have really framed it as it wasn't about queer kids at all, that it was about giving rights back to parents. And a lot of that stems from this fear around losing a relationship with your child. We did have an instance here in the state in Rock Springs where a family sued the district over not notifying them about their child's preferred name. According to Patricia McCoy, that family ultimately lost custody of their child, and there is this fear amongst parents that if they don't know what's going on with their kid might file for emancipation, they might lose custody of their child.
And Patricia McCoy, someone who you spoke with for the article, she's the chair of the Laramie County Moms for Liberty.
Yes, she is the chair of our local branch of the Moms for Liberty group. And she really does not see this as targeting trans kids or queer kids at all. On the flip side of that, we have the director for Wyoming Equality, Sarah Burlingame, who sees this as an intentional attack on trans kids.
I think their intention was to disproportionately impact queer kids, right? Like, regardless of what they said, it was clear that that was what the intention was, because there is not a cohort of the differently nicknamed who are like, please help us, school board, help us, legislators. The differently nicknamed are needing direction here. Like, that's nonsense. And we can just name it for what it is.
And the point that Burlingame is really getting at there is that this isn't about all kids in the district. This is about a very specific group of kids. Burlingame has expressed this concern in the past over other policies that the district has passed regarding queer kids and how they interact in school. And, she does bring up a pretty valid point, which is that we know from data that queer kids, when their identities aren't acknowledged, they're much more likely to participate in suicidal behaviors, substance abuse. Kids can get kicked out of their homes if they're outed to parents who aren't comfortable with that identity. And that is a valid point from Burlingame about this policy. That could potentially happen. The district does have policies in place to remove children from abusive homes, but those policies are along the mandated reporter type policies, where teachers, if they suspect abuse is actively happening, have to report it. They don't necessarily have the ability to, we're not going to call your mom because I suspect that she might be transphobic. They can't really do that. They can choose, they can report a family if they suspect abuse is actively happening, but they can't avoid this policy because they suspect abuse might happen, because that's not a very validated concern.
Mm-hmm. And you noted in your story too, statistic from the Trevor Project that 20% of students feel strong support from their family regarding their identity, and 70% are more likely to feel supported by their friends. And that's from 2022, and that's in Wyoming specifically, those numbers. So, I guess what is the importance of having that in, the school specifically being able to feel comfortable there? Did Burlingame comment on that?
So Burlingame did comment on that. So the Trevor Project is this organization that assesses the plight of queer students queer people in different states. And they're really looking at suicide, basically. They're looking at the mental health. They're looking at, what happens when we, why are we losing these kids? And the flip side of that data is 20% of kids feel strongly supported at home. 80% of queer kids in Wyoming feel low to moderate support at home. And there isn't a category for no support necessarily. Mm-hmm. So those kids that are feeling no support are probably in that low to moderate support area. And Burlingame does talk about how schools need to be a safe place because not all parents are safe.
So it's really important to keep that at the front of your mind when you think, why wouldn't you call some parents? Mm-hmm. Because they will kick them out of their homes, because they will beat them, because we had a 12-year-old child in, is that Evansville? It's just out of Casper.
Yeah.
Who was stabbed by his father. And who went to school the next day and had to tell a counselor, right? Like, my dad stabbed me because he thinks I'm gay. So we have very concrete reasons for saying not all parents are safe. Are the majority of them? Yes, we believe they are. So when we say, like, this is a blunt instrument for a sensitive topic, blunt doesn't do enough justice to, like, how much violence and trauma is behind it.
Burlingame isn't wrong. Like, we did have a 12-year-old child in Evansville who was stabbed by his father because his father suspected that he was gay. And obviously there are legal routes to deal with that and to protect that child after, but it doesn't change the fact that there are parents who aren't safe for their kids. And, you know, Patricia McCoy and Moms for Liberty really do, at least when I spoke with her, they really do function from this place of making these policies for safe parents, for parents who are concerned, for parents who are involved. And Burlingame really brings up this point of, like, well, not all parents are safe or concerned or involved. And McCoy does, you know, bring up this issue of her daughter, while in the district, briefly identified as a boy. And McCoy attributes that to the type of material that she was performing in speech and debate, the type of material that she was given by her speech and debate coaches. She kind of talked me through this story of, you know, her daughter went and did speech and debate. She went did speech and debate. She thought it was a great activity. A lot of parents do. It's very academically involved. And she started doing these pieces that McCoy described as not within their family values. And then eventually, you know, her daughter started not wearing dresses that they had packed for tournaments, or, you know, basically becoming very isolated and beginning to identify as a boy.
So not only did they give her a new name without even saying anything to us, they're giving her pieces that we disagree with. We've told them that. We're asking them to work with us on this. And nobody wanted to listen. Nobody tried to help. Even after she tried to take her life, no one wanted to listen to me. Except for the local Moms for Liberty group. That's how I joined them, because they were the only people that listened to me.
And in her experience, her daughter now, again, identifies as a girl. She came home during COVID, and during that time, they kind of regrouped as a family. And for her daughter, it was just, it wasn't really who she was, and it was due to outside influences. And McCoy and I did talk about how that's not necessarily the case for every kid, that there are kids who are very genuinely feeling, who really genuinely are questioning their gender and, you know, are going to be trans for the rest of their life. But for McCoy, what she wanted from the district after that experience was more communication. She wanted the district to have told her what was going on. And so that experience that she has shared with other parents, and that fear of the school not informing you and losing contact with your kid, really did drive this specific point.
And parents, a lot of parents in our county and in our district feel the same way. They feel like they're not being heard. They feel like they're struggling to get the schools to let them be an active participant in their children's education.
And she does feel like a lot of people want to be more involved in their child's education. And for her kid, you know, she says that she still has friends in the queer community, and to McCoy and her family, this is a difference of belief, and you can be friends with someone if you don't believe the same things. That's not a perspective that every person in the district shares, and a lot of people who are opposed to this policy really do, again, reiterate the difficulty that it puts on teachers to be monitoring what kids are calling each other. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to being in middle school and coming up with code names for crushes, or, you know, being in high school and coming up with goofy nicknames for people on your speech and debate team or your sports team. There are a lot of use for nicknames and alternative names in the social lives of teens, and so I do know that teachers, there is that stress that is still there. And then for advocates for queer students, it really does come back to this does feel targeted. And I think what kind of sums it up is Burlingame illustrates kind of one big issue that seems to be coming back into conversation with the school district consistently this year, which is we are Wyomingites, and we live in this very established culture of don't bother me, I won't bother you. What you do in your house is your business. What I do in my house is mine. Don't tell me what to do. I won't tell you what to do. And McCoy holds that same belief, but they've applied it quite differently in this case.
Like, we're Wyomingites. Like, we have an established culture that works very well for us. And it's, you know, a live and let live culture that says, what name am I going to call you? The name that you asked me to call you. You know?
Right.
It's not more complicated than that.
Regardless of the impact, we are only a semester into the school year, so it'll be hard to see what this looks like until it's been in place for long term, and until we see what it does look like when the policy is violated and how that process actually plays out. And I mean, for now, the policy stands. There's no petition to get it revoked or changed. It stands as is, and for the foreseeable future, students in LCSD1 will spend their first day of the semester having the parental rights policy explained to them, and as one teacher described it, having to really think through how they want to introduce themselves on the first day of class, because there could be very real consequences.
Great. Thank you, Ivy, for that. And you can find that story online on our website or in Saturday's November 9th print edition. But that's all for that. Now let's head to Taylor Staples, our arts and entertainment reporter.
Okay, thanks, Noah. Now to switch gears for a little bit, we'll be talking about the 2025 Grammy nominations. So there are 94 categories that were announced on, I think, either Thursday or Friday. But we are only going to talk about our predictions for the album of the year. So every contender in this category is New Blue Sun by Andre 3000, Cowboy Carter by Beyonce, Short and Sweet by Sabrina Carpenter, Brat by Charlie XCX, Jessie Volume 4 by Jacob Collier, Hit Me Hard and Soft by Billie Eilish, The Rise and Fall of a Midwest Princess by Chappell Roan, and finally, The Tortured Poets Department by Taylor Swift. So there are 8 in the Album of the Year category. What are your guys' predictions for Album of the Year?
I optimistically want to believe that it's not going to be Taylor Swift. Realistically, I wouldn't be surprised if she won Album of the Year. Because of the following that she has. I honestly, though, I don't think it's her best album, and I think that either Brat, Short and Sweet, or Rise and Fall of a Midwest Princess, I think are better composed and much more artistically interesting.
I totally agree. I know it's subjective, but Taylor Swift has had her time in this category. I love her, but I don't know. Selfishly, I really want Hit Me Hard and Soft to be Album of the Year, but I just don't feel like it had enough on the actual album. I think it only had like 10, 11 tracks. It was pretty like, I don't know, it was pretty like low maintenance compared to the rest of her albums, I would say, but also like Short and Sweet, you know, also a selfish little I hope that wins. But I think it's really between Chappell, Sabrina, and honestly Charlie XCX. I can see her winning this category.
Well, I will say that I have definitely entered my Chappell Roan era this year. So on a selfish note, I definitely hope her Rise and Fall of a Midwest Princess wins. I mean, I'm not as familiar with the other artists. I've never been a huge Taylor Swift fan. But I do agree, like, it has to be between her and Sabrina Carpenter's new album. I like Chapel a little bit more. I think she has just, I don't know, a lot of passion, a lot of artistry when it comes to her music, and just watching her perform is something else too. So, I mean, she has my vote. I love Sabrina too, but I feel like Chapel really is a good contender for this one.
Well, for me, I'll start off by saying I do not respect the Grammys as an institution, but out of the options on this list, there's good albums on there. I think the cultural impact of Brat around the world, I definitely had a Brat summer. I hope you all did too. I think the Billy album was incredible, but I think everyone has infused a little bit of their selfishness in this picks, and I think I will too. I don't know if I've mentioned it too much, but I'm actually from the same town as Chapel Roan, so and her album was incredible, I think, and represent the 417. Shout out Springfield. So I think Chapel Roan, I hope that her album takes the top prize this year.
You can check out the rest of the nominations on our website or variety.com.
Great. Thank you, Taylor, for bringing us that. That's all for this week's episode. Thank you, Ivy Secrest, Hannah Shields, and again, Taylor Staples for contributing to this week's episode. Be sure to tune back in next Wednesday for more.